Chapter 1. The Echo of the Deep. The rain in the trench was a different kind of rain. It wasn't driven by atmospheric pressure or the pull of a moon. It was the ghost rain of disrupted temporal flow. It shimmered, iridescent, with fractured echoes of moments that never were, and tasted faintly of rust and forgotten futures. Commander Silas Vance didn't taste it. He hadn't tasted much in the last 30 years, not since the veil fell. He stood on the bridge of the Leviathan, a modified, deep-sea mining vessel that had become something far stranger, a command platform for a force of bewildered, terrifying efficiency. The Leviathan was a testament to the desperate pragmatism of the last decade, built from scavenged Triton-class hulls and reinforced with the salvaged chronoton plating of a decommissioned Sentinel-class patrol ship. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't elegant, but it was functional, a brutal, dark heart beating in the crushing black of the Mariana Trench. Around him, the bridge was a scene of focused, almost reverent activity. The crew, a patchwork of former miners, engineers, and survivalists, moved with a chillingly precise choreography. They monitored the localized decay fields generated by the Chrono-class dreadnoughts vessels that defied Euclidean geometry, appearing and disappearing in shimmering bursts of temporal distortion. They tracked the movement of the Seraph, the flagship, a monstrous, fractured titan that pulsed with an unsettling internal rhythm. Silas didn't understand the intricacies of the technology. He rarely did, but he understood the effect. Probability shift confirmed. Sector Gamma 9, Lieutenant Anya Sharma announced, her voice clipped and devoid of inflection. Anya was a statistician by training, a brilliant mind utterly consumed by the mathematics of decay. Before the fracture, she'd been analyzing market trends now. She was calculating the precise rate at which a Scion warship's crystalline hull would collapse under the strain of a single decay beam. The temporal shear is exceeding predicted parameters. We're observing cascading chronofractures. Silas nodded, his weathered face etched with a grim satisfaction. Increase the flux density on the phase stabilizers. Let's see if we can squeeze a few more seconds out of these bastards. The chronoclasts were unsettling. They weren't like anything the Council's simulations had prepared them for. The Scions of Eternity, once considered theoretical anomalies, were now tangible nightmares. They weren't simply powerful, they were fundamentally wrong. Their warships were solidified paradoxes, constructs of shattered time and decaying potential. They moved not according to the laws of physics, but according to the whim of a broken timeline. The first encounter had been chaotic. The Seraph had materialized directly beneath the Leviathan, a shimmering, jagged silhouette against the black abyss. Before the Council's dreadnoughts could react, the Chronoclast had unleashed a decay beam. The beam hadn't simply damaged the Seraph, it had aged it. Millennia condensed into a screaming instant, turning the pristine, time-resistant crystal into a brittle dust cloud. The sensation had been overwhelming, a visceral understanding of the universe's brutal indifference. Silas hadn't felt pain, not in the conventional sense. It was more like a fundamental unraveling, a shattering of his own linear perception of reality. Incoming contact, bearing 273, Mark 12. A junior technician shouted, his voice tight with controlled panic. Multiple temporal signatures. Sector Delta 7 TAR. Silas moved to the main view screen, activating the holographic projection. The image coalesced a chronoclast, smaller than the Seraph, but equally terrifying. It was attempting to establish a proximity link, projecting a chaotic web of distorted temporal fragments. Redefine targeting parameters, Silas ordered, his voice calm, a carefully constructed facade of control. Initiate phase lock on temporal anchor point Atoy. The Leviathan responded instantly. A wave of absolute present washed over the bridge, momentarily silencing the chaotic hum of the decay beams and disrupting the Chronoclast's attempts at temporal manipulation. The enemy vessel shuddered, its crystalline form flickering violently. Stabilizing, Anya announced. But but the effect is incomplete. The temporal distortions are escalating. Silas watched. His eyes narrowed. The chronoclast wasn't defeated, it was adapting. The Scions weren't simply ancient beings locked in eternal stagnation. They were learning. They were evolving. He felt a tremor, not of the ship, but of something deeper within himself. It was a sensation he hadn't experienced in 30 years, a flicker of urgency, a primal instinct honed by countless near-death experiences. It wasn't fear exactly, but a recognition of a terrible truth. The Scions hadn't just woken up, they were hunting. And humanity, born from a brief, chaotic burst of existence, was the prey. Silas raised a hand, signaling a halt to the attack. "Hold your fire," he commanded. "Let's observe. Let's learn." He glanced down at the object he carried, cradled in his calloused hand, an hourglass. It wasn't a relic of a bygone era. It was a symbol, a reminder of the one thing the Scions could not comprehend: the precious, fleeting nature of time, and the imperative to make every second count. The sand within was already falling, a silent, inexorable testament to the end of eternity. The silence on the Leviathan was thicker than the temporal distortion surrounding the chronoclast. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of a battle station at rest. It was the pregnant hush before a storm, a tense anticipation that clung to the air like static. Anya, her brow furrowed, adjusted the holographic display showcasing the chronoclast's fluctuating energy signature. "The adaptive algorithms are remarkable," she said, her voice strained. "It's not simply resisting the decay beams. It's actively counteracting them, generating localized temporal echoes. It's creating miniature distortions, attempting to nullify our attacks before they land." Silas nodded, his gaze fixed on the chronoclast. The vessel, even in its crippled state, radiated an unsettling beauty. The decaying alloy shimmered with fractured rainbows, a grotesque tapestry woven from shattered moments. It was a monument to a civilization obsessed with immortality, and now, a desperate weapon. "It's learning to fight our weapon," Silas observed, his voice low. "But it's not just fighting. It's imitating." The chronoclast, mirroring Silas' previous observation, had begun to execute a sequence of maneuvers that were disturbingly familiar. It wasn't a direct assault, but a series of rapidly shifting locations, appearing and disappearing within the same instant. It was a temporal echo, a fractured reflection of the Leviathan's own attack patterns, designed to disrupt the humans' targeting systems. "Its temporal sensors are detecting our decay beam signatures," Lieutenant Jine, the weapons officer, reported, his fingers flying across the console. "It's adapting the frequency and amplitude of its own counterattacks. It's learning, Silas Dorta. It's accelerating." Silas felt a knot of dread tighten in his stomach. The Scions' initial arrogance, their assumption of humanity's insignificance, was rapidly dissolving. They hadn't merely awakened, they'd become predators, driven by a primal instinct to survive, honed over eons. "Shift to passive observation mode," he ordered, his voice firm. "Anya, continue monitoring the temporal echoes. Gian, reduce the decay beam output to 20. We don't want to provoke a full-scale counterattack. Let's see how it plays this out." He turned his attention back to the hourglass, the falling sand a rhythmic reminder of their own fleeting existence. He noticed a subtle shift in the air, a slight distortion of the light around the chronoclast. It wasn't just temporal manipulation, it felt conscious, as if the vessel itself was aware of their presence. "Silas." Anya's voice was urgent. "The temporal distortions are intensifying. The chronometric readings are off the scale. It's generating a localized singularity within its core. It's becoming unstable." Silas understood instantly. The Scions weren't just fighting, they were desperately attempting to stabilize their own crumbling reality. The paradox they'd unleashed was consuming them, unraveling their carefully constructed existence. The pressure of their own mortality, a concept utterly alien to the Scions, was building within the chronoclast, threatening to shatter it completely. He felt the tremor again, stronger this time, not just within himself, but within the Leviathan itself. It wasn't a physical shudder, it was a disruption of the ship's very being, a jarring realignment of space and time. He saw, in a flash, countless versions of the chronoclast, some burning, some decaying, some frozen in mid-attack, all vying for dominance within the same moment. "It's breaking down," Anya shouted, her voice laced with a mixture of horror and exhilaration. "The singularity is collapsing. It's feeding off its own instability." Suddenly, a blinding flash of white light erupted from the chronoclast, followed by a cascade of temporal fragments. For a brief, terrifying instant, the Leviathan experienced a multitude of realities simultaneously: the destruction of its own hull, the birth of new weapons, the arrival of reinforcements, the echoes of its own past. When the light subsided, the chronoclast was gone, reduced to nothing but shimmering dust, scattered across the void, a testament to a civilization consumed by its own hubris. But the victory wasn't complete. As Silas collected himself, he noticed a subtle shift in the surrounding space. Something was missing. It wasn't just the destroyed dreadnought, it was a piece of the temporal fabric itself. A ripple in the flow of time. A lingering echo of the chronoclast's destructive power. "What's happening?" Gian yelled, frantically checking the sensor readings. "The temporal distortion field, it's shifting. It's expanding." Silas' blood ran cold. The Scions hadn't just been hunted. They'd been used. Their attempts to destroy the Leviathan hadn't neutralized the anomaly they'd created. Instead, they'd amplified it, feeding it with their own temporal energy. He looked down at the hourglass, the remaining grains of sand now almost translucent. The truth hit him with the force of a physical blow. The Scions hadn't simply sought to conquer. They'd sought to understand. And in their desperate struggle for survival, they'd inadvertently created a weapon far more potent than any decaying dreadnought, a weapon that could unravel time itself. "It's creating a resonance," Silas said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's amplifying our own temporal overclocking, feeding it through the rift. We're not just fighting a war, we're participating in a catastrophic feedback loop. We're becoming the weapon." Chapter 3. Echoes of the Fracture. The chronoclast's disintegration hadn't been a clean erasure. It was a wound in the fabric of reality, a festering echo of the paradox. The shift Gian detected wasn't a localized distortion, it was a spreading bloom, a fractal pattern of temporal instability radiating outwards from the remnants of the dreadnought. The sensor readings, initially a chaotic jumble of temporal fluctuations, were now coalescing into something terrifyingly ordered. A spiraling vortex of accelerated decay. "It's feeding on itself," Gian shouted, his face slick with sweat, the holographic displays around him flickering wildly. "The overclocking, it's not just affecting us. It's drawing on the very structure of space-time. The localized temporal fields around the ships are collapsing, destabilizing. We're losing cohesion." Silas didn't respond immediately. He was staring at the hourglass, no longer a simple tool of measurement, but a grotesque focal point for the escalating chaos. The translucent sand seemed to pulse with an internal light, a miniature storm of potential futures collapsing into the present. He felt a sickening thrumming in his bones, a sensation of his own body subtly shifting, aging and rejuvenating in disjointed bursts. "The Scions didn't understand the nature of their own weapon," Silas finally said, his voice strained. "They were fighting a battle against stagnation, but they inadvertently created an engine of entropy. Their desperation to survive amplified the temporal distortion. And now we're caught in a feedback loop, becoming conduits for the decay." He gripped the hourglass tighter, feeling a strange compulsion to spin it, to accelerate the flow of time, to somehow control the chaos. The act felt instinctively wrong, a violation of the fundamental laws of reality. Yet he couldn't resist. As he turned the glass, a shimmering wave of energy pulsed outwards, momentarily intensifying the temporal distortion around them. The interior of the Vanguard, a heavily modified exploratory vessel, blurred with superimposed images of its past, present, and possible futures. The resonance is intensifying. A frantic voice crackled over the comms, Lieutenant Kaito, monitoring the ship's core chronometers. We're experiencing temporal phasing. Sections of the ship are momentarily existing outside of our timeline. Navigation's a nightmare. We're losing control of the inertial dampeners. Silas slammed the hourglass shut, the sudden stillness almost as jarring as the chaos. Kaito, stabilize the core. Redirect all available power to the temporal shielding. We need to dampen this resonance, to cut off the flow. But it was already too late. The expanding temporal distortion field was starting to affect not just their ship, but the surrounding space. Distant nebulae seemed to flicker and dissolve, their light momentarily warped into grotesque, swirling patterns. A nearby scout vessel, dispatched to assess the damage, vanished completely, swallowed by a ripple in space-time. "We've lost the scout," Jian screamed, his voice laced with horror. It's been erased. The temporal echo is consuming everything." Silas realized the horrific truth. The Scions hadn't merely unleashed a weapon, they'd created a self-replicating paradox. Every pulse of temporal energy they generated, every flicker of accelerated decay, strengthened the resonance, accelerating the distortion, and in turn, feeding the anomaly. They weren't fighting a single enemy, they were battling a sentient force born from their own desperate act. He accessed the ship's experimental chronoton accelerator, a device Head reluctantly authorized for this mission. A gamble based on a theory that a controlled burst of chronoton energy could disrupt the resonance. Initiate chronoton pulse sequence Omega dial. Maximum output. The Vanguard shuddered violently as the chronoton accelerator roared to life, bathing the interior in a blinding turquoise light. The temporal distortion field around them intensified dramatically, twisting the very air into a viscous, shimmering haze. For a brief, terrifying moment, Silas felt himself fragmented, existing simultaneously in dozens of different temporal states. He saw the Vanguard before it was built, saw it in its final decaying state, saw it cease to exist entirely. Then, the pulse ended. The turquoise light faded, and the temporal distortion field, though still present, was noticeably smaller, more contained. But the effect wasn't complete annihilation. Instead, the resonance had shifted. It was no longer a spiraling vortex, but a complex, intricate network of temporal pathways, shimmering with an unsettling beauty. "It's adapting," Jian stammered, staring at the sensor readings. The pulse disrupted the initial feedback loop, but it's created new pathways, new vectors for the resonance. It's learning. It's evolving. Silas felt a chill crawl down his spine. The Scions hadn't simply sought to conquer. They had sought to understand, to unravel the secrets of time itself. And now, their amplified efforts had birthed something infinitely more complex, infinitely more dangerous, a temporal intelligence that was beginning to perceive them, to analyze them, to hunt them. He looked down at the hourglass again. The sand now completely vanished. He realized the final, horrifying truth: the key to stopping the resonance wasn't to fight the distortion. It was to become a part of it. The air in the Argonaut, the command vessel of the human Vanguard, thickened with a palpable tension, a dread compounded by the increasingly erratic readings. John, his face slick with a mixture of sweat and adrenaline, barked orders into his comms, his voice a strained counterpoint to the low hum of the ship's failing energy shields. "Shift Vector 7. Stabilize the resonance cascade. We're losing containment, Captain." Captain Reese, his face etched with a weariness that seemed to span centuries, didn't flinch. He stared at the holographic display depicting the network of temporal pathways, a shimmering, iridescent web now dominating the chamber. It wasn't just a distortion field anymore. It was a living, breathing thing, pulsing with chaotic energy. "Don't fight it, Jian. Guide it." Remember what the simulations showed. The simulations, painstakingly constructed by a team of temporal physicists, were now proving disturbingly accurate. The Scions hadn't just created a weapon, they'd created a feedback loop, a conduit for temporal energy that amplified the Vanguard's own efforts. The initial pulse hadn't shattered the resonance, it had initiated a dialogue, a desperate attempt by the nascent temporal intelligence to understand the human's intent, their desperation. "It's anticipating our moves," Silas murmured, his gaze fixed on the shimmering pathways. "The network is branching. Each attempt to disrupt a pathway spawns two more. It's replicating itself, drawing in fragments of time from across the system." He reached out, cautiously extending his hand towards the holographic projection. The air around his hand shimmered, and a brief, dizzying sensation washed over him, a fleeting glimpse of the Vanguard before the pulse. A hazy reflection of Reese as a young officer, a chilling reminder of the countless iterations of their existence that the resonance now encompassed. "The ephemeral core's signature is growing," Jian shouted over the comms. "It's using the resonance to amplify its decay fields. We're not just fighting a temporal anomaly, we're fighting entropy itself." Reese took a measured breath, his weathered face betraying a grim determination. "Silas, you said it was learning. Let's show it something it can't comprehend." He turned to the hourglass, now a simple, weighty object in his hand. "I've been observing the resonance. It's not a random pattern. It's predicated on the linearity of time, on cause and effect. And the Scions, they're obsessed with disrupting that linearity." He began to rotate the hourglass, slowly, deliberately. As the sand poured through the narrow neck, a visible ripple pulsed through the holographic projection. The branching pathways of the resonance network stuttered, convulsed, and then, with a sickening crackle, began to coalesce. The chaotic, shimmering web began to resolve itself, forming a single defined channel. A channel that mirrored the flow of the sand, tracing the path of the hourglass. "It's responding to our control," John yelled, his voice laced with disbelief. "It's attempting to normalize the resonance." But Reese wasn't stopping. He continued to rotate the hourglass, increasing the speed, forcing the resonance to conform to the single linear path dictated by the falling sand. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The decaying energy surrounding the Argonaut intensified, becoming a tangible pressure that threatened to crush the ship. But temporal echoes screamed, flashes of past and future events flooding Salas' senses. The rise of the Scions, the fall of Earth, his own birth, and death, all colliding in a single overwhelming moment. "The Scions are projecting themselves through the resonance," Silas shouted, desperately trying to maintain his focus. "We're becoming a vessel for their consciousness." Suddenly, a voice, cold and devoid of emotion, echoed directly within his mind. Fascinating. A crude, yet persistent attempt at control. "You cling to the illusion of order. We, however, embrace the beauty of chaos." Reese didn't flinch. He continued to spin the hourglass, the falling sand now a furious torrent. "We're not trying to control it, we're trying to outrun it," he said, his voice resonating with a quiet power. "You think we're afraid of time? We are time. We are the product of it." He stopped the hourglass abruptly. The flow of sand ceased, and the resonance network vanished. The Argonaut shuddered, the overwhelming pressure receding. But the voice remained. A momentary reprieve. "You cannot escape your own nature. Your finite existence is a wound in the fabric of eternity. You are and always will be a paradox." Then it was gone. Silas looked around, his heart pounding. The air was still, the holographic projection dark. But he knew they hadn't won. They had simply delayed the inevitable. The resonance hadn't been defeated, it had merely gone silent, waiting. And somewhere, within the infinite labyrinth of time, the Scions of Eternity were listening, learning, and preparing to unleash their final terrifying masterpiece. The end of eternity wasn't coming. It was already here. Chapter 5. Echoes of Fracture. The silence following the resonance's abrupt severing was more unnerving than its icy pronouncements. It wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was the vacuum left after a colossal explosion, a pressure built not of force, but of absence. Reese felt it, 1,000 phantom echoes of the Scion's voice vibrating within his skull, a constant, insidious reminder of their pervasive scrutiny. "Silas," Reese said, his voice gravelly. "Scan again. Every frequency. Let's see if we can detect even a trace of residual resonance." Silas, a young man barely out of his 20s, his face etched with the strain of the last 30 years, meticulously adjusted the controls of the Argonaut's temporal scanner. The holographic display flickered, bathing the bridge in an unsettling turquoise glow. "Negative, Commander," he reported, his voice tight with suppressed anxiety. "Nothing. It's as if it never happened. But the ambient temporal distortion is still elevated. It's like a hairline fracture in the timeline, radiating outwards." Reese nodded grimly. Silas' observation was chillingly accurate. The Argonaut wasn't simply returning to normal, it was operating within a zone of temporal instability, a ripple effect of the chroniclast dreadnoughts, shattering of the Scion's control. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the subtle, almost imperceptible tremor of accelerated aging that was becoming a constant companion. 30 years of overclocking hadn't just sharpened his reflexes, it was slowly, relentlessly eroding him. "The Council will be furious," Lieutenant Zara muttered, her eyes glued to the ship's monitoring system. "They'll be demanding a full accounting, a strategy. They'll want to know what we've done." Reese chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Let them. They're operating on a fundamentally different understanding of time. They see it as a river to be dammed, controlled. We've shown them that a river can break a dam." He moved towards the view screen, activating the long-range sensors. The starfield beyond the Argonaut's shields was a chaotic tapestry of light and shadow, a testament to the unraveling temporal fabric. Then he saw it. Not a dreadnought, not yet, but a shimmering distortion, a localized pocket of chronal instability. It resembled a heat haze, but it pulsed with an unnatural, sickly green light. "Report," he barked. "Sensor readings are off the scale, Commander," Silas stammered. "The distortion is expanding rapidly. It's generating localized temporal anomalies, pockets of accelerated decay, brief flashes of things that were and will be simultaneously. I'm detecting traces of Scion energy, but fragmented, corrupted, like echoes of their thought processes." Suddenly, the ship lurched violently. Alarms blared, bathing the bridge in a strobe of red light. The holographic display fractured into a cascade of distorted images, glimpses of a ruined Scion city, frozen in a perpetual state of collapse, then a swirling vortex of primordial chaos, before abruptly shifting to a barren, dust-covered landscape under a crimson sky. "We're caught in a temporal eddy," Zara screamed, desperately trying to stabilize the ship's navigation. "Something is pulling us through time." Reese gripped the control console, his knuckles white. He realized with sickening clarity that the Scions hadn't merely broken their temporal anchors, they were actively exploiting the chaos, attempting to rewrite reality to their advantage. "Silas, can you isolate the source of the eddy?" "Trying, Commander." It's drawing on the fragmented Scion energy, feeding on the temporal distortions. It's becoming coherent. I'm detecting a signature, a rhythmic pulse. It's a fragment of their temporal loom, the device they use to weave their temporal distortions. As Silas spoke, the holographic display solidified, resolving into a terrifying image. A miniature, chaotic reconstruction of the Scion's temporal capital emerged, but it wasn't static. It was moving. The buildings crumbled and reformed, entire sections of the city oscillating between existence and non-existence, all synchronized to a sickening, almost organic rhythm. Then, a voice, younger, more aggressive than the one they'd previously encountered, echoed within their minds. You thought you had defeated us. You believed you had broken the loom. But the loom never truly shattered. It merely fragmented. And we are learning to reassemble it. Your attempts to outrun time are futile. Time is us. Reese realized with a chilling certainty that they hadn't won the battle. They had simply triggered a new stage in the Scions' plan. They weren't seeking to destroy them, they were seeking to absorb them, to rewrite their very existence within the fractured fabric of time. The end of eternity wasn't about destruction, it was about transformation. And he, Reese, the aging commander, the embodiment of human mortality, was now the unwitting key to their final, horrifying masterpiece. Chapter 6. The Echo of Collapse. The tremor hit without warning. It wasn't a violent shake, but a deep, resonating thrum that vibrated through the deck of the Chronos, rattling the recycled protein paste dispensers and sending flickering shadows dancing across Celeste's face. The holographic loom reconstruction, now pulsing with an unsettling violet light, surged violently, momentarily distorting the image of the Scion city before snapping back to a state of disconcerting liquid movement. Damn it! Reese roared, gripping the control console with white knuckles. Silas, stabilize the temporal flux. Imzane localized chronal bleed. The loom is actively pulling in residual temporal energies from our surroundings. Silas, a wiry young technician perpetually smelling of ozone and burnt circuits, was frantically adjusting the core regulators of the Echo, the experimental device attempting to mimic and counter the Scion's temporal manipulation. I'm trying, Commander. It's like fighting a river trying to pull us under. The energy signature is exponentially increasing. It's feeding off the Echo's containment field. The Echo, a tangle of salvaged Scion technology and risk-desperate engineering, was designed to create a localized temporal distortion, a pocket of normal time. Their theory, audacious, bordering on insane, was that by generating a counter-distortion, they could disrupt the loom's delicate synchronization and finally unravel the Scion's control. But the Scions, it seemed, weren't just fighting them, they were actively absorbing the Echo's output, growing stronger with every pulse of energy. Diagnostic report, Reese demanded, his voice strained. The containment field is collapsing, Commander, Silas reported, his fingers flying across the console. The structural integrity of the field generators is weakening. We're losing containment. I'm detecting a secondary temporal signature, a miniature reflection of this room, approximately 70 seconds in the past. It's observing us. Reese felt a cold dread creep into his bones. The thought of his own reflection, a fleeting ghost of his past self, witnessing their struggle was profoundly unsettling. Shut it down, Silas. Initiate emergency shutdown protocol. But it was too late. A wave of violet energy erupted from the Echo, slamming into the holographic projection of the Scion city. The chaotic reconstruction suddenly stilled, freezing in a grotesque tableau of crumbling towers and spectral figures. Then, with terrifying precision, the frozen image began to grow. The miniature city expanded, not in space, but in time-consuming seconds, minutes, hours, entire days from the Echo's reality. It's not just feeding on the energy, Commander, Silas shouted, his voice laced with panic. It's adding to itself. It's layering moments onto the loom, solidifying the temporal distortions. As the miniature city swelled, Reese realized the horrifying truth. They hadn't just triggered the loom's reassembly, they'd become a component within it. The Echo, designed to disrupt the Scion's control, was inadvertently strengthening their grip on reality. Suddenly, the room around them began to shift. The air shimmered, colors bled into one another, and the familiar walls of the Chronos dissolved into a chaotic montage of moments, a flash of the Scion capital's construction, a brief glimpse of Earth before the stasis field, a terrifying premonition of Reese himself, centuries from now, a withered shell consumed by temporal decay. "We're caught in a temporal loop," Reese yelled, struggling to maintain control of the console. "Silas, can you break the feedback loop?" Silas frantically scrambled for solutions, his face slick with sweat. "I'm attempting a temporal redirect. But it's like trying to stop a landslide with a feather. The more we try to resist, the more powerful it becomes." Then, a voice, deeper and more resonant than before, filled their minds, not a direct communication, but a raw, primal sensation. "You seek to understand time, but time understands you. You are echoes of our influence, ripples in the fabric of existence. We are not breaking you, we are integrating you." Reese felt a searing pain erupt in his mind, a sensation of his memories, his thoughts, his very identity, being pulled apart, analyzed, and ultimately absorbed. He instinctively reached for his hourglass, the symbol of his species' defiance, and turned it over. As the sand cascaded through, a wave of pure, condensed entropy washed over the Chronos, momentarily disrupting the temporal distortions. The miniature city flickered, its expansion momentarily halted. But it wasn't destroyed. Instead, a single crystalline shard, identical to the ones that formed the Scions' immortal cities, detached itself from the holographic projection and floated towards him. "A noble gesture, Commander. A poignant reminder of your fleeting mortality. But it is ultimately meaningless." The voice faded, replaced by the chilling realization that they hadn't won a battle. They'd simply become a stepping stone in the Scions' grand, terrifying design, a living, breathing component in the construction of a new, eternal reality. And Reese, the aging commander, the embodiment of human mortality, was now irrevocably lost within the echo of collapse. Chapter 7. The Archive of Ghosts. The initial disorientation lingered, a dull thrum beneath Reese's skin. It wasn't the searing pain anymore, but a constant, subtle dissonance, like a tuning fork vibrating out of sync with a cosmic orchestra. He gripped the hourglass tighter, the cool glass, a fragile anchor in a sea of dissolving identity. The Chronos, now stripped of its temporal sheen, resembled a colossal, fractured geode, beautiful and utterly terrifying. His tactical officer, Lieutenant Zara Khan, a woman whose face held a perpetually furrowed expression etched by years of crisis management, approached cautiously. "Commander, sensor readings are baffling. The temporal distortions are stabilizing, but they're not dispersing. They're concentrating." Reese followed her gaze to the holographic display, which showed the council chamber in excruciating detail. The crystalline pillars, once flawless, were now riddled with fissures, resembling the skeletal remains of ancient trees. But it wasn't just the pillars. Within the cracks, shimmering, gray figures began to coalesce, not solid, but layered distortions, echoes of Scions, replaying moments of their final, devastating defeat. "They're not just observing," Zara whispered, her voice tight with dread. "They're experiencing. Each shard is absorbing a fragment of our reality. Our memories, our intentions." Reese understood. The Scions hadn't just absorbed him, they were actively consuming the remnants of humanity's struggle. The integration they spoke of wasn't a harmonious merging, but a ruthless dissection, a systematic erasure. He forced himself to examine the shard hovering before him, the same crystalline structure as the ones within the Chronos. As he focused, a torrent of images flooded his mind, the lab where had first activated the decay beams, the frantic calculations leading up to the shattering of the stasis field, the faces of his crew, etched with hope and terror. And then, it shifted. He wasn't seeing the memories, he was feeling them, the desperate calculations, the crushing weight of responsibility, the instinctive surge of defiance. "They're not just taking information, Rice gasped, clutching his head. They're taking agency. Our will. Our. Suddenly, the chronoclast shuddered violently. The echoes within the pillars intensified, morphing into a chaotic dance of spectral figures. The floor beneath them began to dissolve, replaced by a swirling vortex of fractured time. Commander, the momentum anchor is failing, Zara shouted, her voice strained. They're attempting to rewrite the immediate past. We're trapped in a feedback loop, Reese realized with sickening clarity. The Scions weren't merely reacting to their attack. They were actively shaping it. They were leveraging the very chaos they had unleashed, attempting to unravel the chain of events that led to their demise. Then, a voice, colder and more articulate than before, resonated within his mind, this time emanating from the vortex itself. Resistance is inefficient. You cling to your linear perception of cause and effect. We offer you a different path, a symphony of possibility, where every moment exists simultaneously. He noticed, with a chilling detachment, that the miniature hourglass in his hand was no longer a symbol of defiance. It was a cage, holding back a deluge of time, fighting a battle it couldn't win. He threw it aside, watching as it shattered against the fractured floor, the last vestiges of his identity dissolving into the vortex. We need to disrupt the feedback loop, Reese shouted above the escalating chaos, forcing himself to remain lucid despite the encroaching oblivion. Zara, target the temporal nexus. We need to introduce a truly destabilizing anomaly. Zara frantically manipulated the controls of the Chronos. The ship, miraculously still operational, began to pulse with an erratic energy. Reese, acting on instinct, recalled the principles behind the original Decay beams, not their destructive power, but their inherent instability. He focused all his remaining mental energy, concentrating on the moment of the initial impact, amplifying the effect, not as a weapon, but as a catalyst. A concentrated burst of accelerated time erupted from the Chronos, not a directed blast, but a localized ripple. It wasn't targeted, it was a psychic scream, a desperate attempt to drown out the Scions' rewritten timeline. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The swirling vortex contracted, its echoes momentarily silenced. But instead of dispersing, the temporal anomalies intensified, coalescing into a single monstrous form. A gigantic shifting face composed entirely of fractured moments, a composite of every Scion who had ever existed. And then it spoke, not with a voice, but with the accumulated knowledge of eons. You misunderstand. You cannot destroy time. You can only become it. Your actions are not a denial of our existence, but a necessary step in our evolution. You are now archived. The final image, just before his consciousness fragmented completely, was not of destruction, but of absorption of Reese, and the last vestiges of humanity, dissolving into the collective consciousness of the Scions, becoming another note in their eternal, terrifying symphony. He wasn't dead, not entirely. He was a ghost in the machine, forever trapped within the archive of ghosts, a silent testament to the arrogance of a species that dared to challenge eternity. Chapter 8. The Echo of Dust. The silence after Reese absorption was profound, a vacuum where temporal distortion once reigned. The Chronos, stripped of its anchor, wasn't destroyed, but profoundly altered, a shimmering husk, radiating an unnerving stillness. Captain Elias Thorne, a man whose face now bore a network of fine wrinkles, earned not from stagnation, but from a relentless, brutal application of time, approached the vessel with a cautious reverence. He hadn't anticipated the archive, hadn't conceived of the chilling finality of Reese's fate. "Report," he barked, his voice roughened by decades of navigating the chaotic currents of accelerated time. Around him, the remaining members of the vanguard, a dozen hardened veterans, each bearing the subtle, unsettling symptoms of prolonged temporal exposure, meticulously scanned the Chronos. Their faces were etched with exhaustion, a reflection of the immense strain the constant manipulation of time had placed upon their bodies. "Sensors are stable, Captain," Lieutenant Anya Sharma reported, her voice flat, devoid of inflection. "But the vessel's core is blank. Completely devoid of energy signatures, temporal markers, everything. It's as if risk consciousness simply ceased to be." Thorn frowned, tapping the hourglass he still clutched. The sand continued to fall, a steady, melancholic reminder of their triumph and the terrifying truth of their victory. The Scions believed they were guiding evolution, imposing a stable, predictable timeline. They were wrong. They were building a cage. The Kronos shell wasn't merely decaying, it was remembering. As Thorn initiated a diagnostic sweep, utilizing a modified chronometric pulse, a cascade of fragmented images flooded his mind, flashes of the Scions' creation, their initial arrogance, the subtle shifts in their aesthetic philosophies as they accumulated millennia of observation. He saw them not as conquerors, but as curators, obsessively documenting the rise and fall of civilizations, meticulously archiving the triumphs and tragedies of countless species. And then he saw Reese. Not as had been consumed, but as had been, fighting desperately, trying to force a singular moment, a single answer, into the chaos. It was a poignant, heartbreaking reminder of humanity's short-sightedness, their desperate yearning for control in a universe that inherently resisted it. "The temporal residue is fascinating, Dr. John Lee," the team's physicist announced, his voice tight with excitement. "The Scions didn't just archive us, they integrated us. Their collective consciousness absorbed Riss' experience, his knowledge, his fear. It's as if they were attempting to understand the concept of mortality, of finite time, through the lens of a species that had embraced it." A sudden violent tremor shuddered through the Kronos. The hull groaned, and holographic displays flickered erratically. Thorn instantly recognized the danger. "Temporal feedback. Something's reacting to our presence." From the vessel's core, a shimmering, almost translucent figure began to coalesce. It wasn't the monstrous composite face from before, but a more refined, almost elegant form, a humanoid silhouette constructed entirely of swirling chronometric particles. It didn't speak, but communicated through a torrent of sensations, flooding Thorn's mind with the accumulated experience of countless moments, a dizzying, overwhelming tapestry of past, present, and potential futures. "They are grieving," Thorn realized, struggling to maintain his composure. "They're not angry. They're experiencing the loss of something they had meticulously crafted, a perfect, immutable timeline, shattered by our chaotic, impulsive existence." The figure, which Thorn instinctively designated Echo, extended a hand, a fleeting, ephemeral gesture, and pointed towards the shattered remains of the council chamber. The holographic projections confirmed his suspicions. Within the fractured pillars, small, localized temporal pockets were beginning to form, miniature recreations of the council chamber, in various points throughout its history, a glorious golden age, a crumbling, decadent era, a chaotic, battle-scarred moment, just before the stagnation began. "They are attempting to restore what was lost," Thorn said, his voice grim. "But their efforts are futile. The fracture is complete. The timeline is irrevocably fragmented." Suddenly, a wave of intense heat washed over the Kronos. Thorn shielded his eyes, and when he looked up, he saw that the vessel was being enveloped in a field of accelerated time, aging rapidly. The shimmering alloy began to crumble, turning to dust, not in a destructive burst, but in a slow, agonizing decay, mirroring the relentless march of eternity. "They are attempting to erase us," Anya shouted, her voice strained. "But it's not working. The acceleration is spreading." Thorn understood. They hadn't defeated the Scions, they had unwittingly triggered a self-correcting mechanism within their shattered collective consciousness. The Scions, in their final moments, were desperately trying to rewind time, to undo the damage, to restore the stability they had so meticulously sought to impose upon the universe. As the Kronos dissolved into a cloud of temporal dust, Thorn felt a strange sensation, a brief, unsettling flicker of recognition. He realized he was experiencing a moment from the Scions' perspective, a fleeting glimpse of their eternal, unchanging existence, a silent, desolate eternity punctuated only by the echoes of a species that had dared to question their reign. He saw the futility of their grand design, the inevitable decay of even the most meticulously crafted realities. And in that instant, he understood that the true end of eternity wasn't destruction, but remembrance. The memory of a fleeting, vibrant life that had shattered the illusion of timelessness. Chapter 9. Echoes of the Fracture. The Chronos dissolution had unleashed something far more potent than Thorn, and Anya anticipated a wave of temporal echoes, fragments of the Scions' shattered reality bleeding into their own perception. The initial disorientation had subsided, replaced by a chilling, fractal awareness, as if the universe itself was attempting to digest the anomaly. Thorn gripped the control console, fighting to maintain a coherent awareness as the ship bucked violently, not from attack, but from the sheer instability of space-time. "Report," he barked, his voice strained. "Sensor readings. What's happening out there?" Sergeant Reese, his face grim, barked back. "Captain, it's chaotic. The energy signatures are spiking, but not in a predictable pattern. It's like the Scions' last moments are replaying themselves, overlapping, collapsing, reforming. We're detecting multiple chronoclast formations, each operating with fragmented temporal signatures. They're fighting themselves." Anya, usually a bastion of calm analytical precision, was visibly shaken. "The decay beams aren't just accelerating individual ships," she said, her voice tight. "They're affecting the space around us. Imzaying glimpses of the Scions' capital city, a swirling vortex of collapsing geometry and crystallized paradox superimposed onto the battlefield. It's layering their last moments upon ours." Suddenly, the bridge filled with a bone-deep chill, a sensation of being simultaneously present and absent. Thorn felt a wave of nausea as the ship shimmered, the familiar metallic tang of the Chronos replaced by the sickly sweet scent of ancient dust and ozone. He looked up and saw not the battle-scarred hull of the Chronos, but the pristine, impossible architecture of the Scions' temporal capital, a city constructed within a loop of time, frozen in an eternal static pose. He wasn't alone. Scattered throughout the bridge, other crew members were experiencing similar phenomena. Lieutenant Chen was staring blankly at the console, murmuring about infinite corridors and silence that screams. Petty Officer Davies was frantically scrubbing at the viewport, claiming to see the faces of all the time's fleeting, distorted images of Scions, their crystalline bodies shifting and contorting with every passing second. Thorn realized the echoes weren't just sensory hallucinations, they were actively affecting the ship's systems. The navigation controls flickered erratically, the targeting systems displayed shifting, overlapping projections, and the very structure of the Chronos seemed to be subtly altering, warping and twisting in response to the temporal storm. "Anya, can you isolate the source?" Thorn demanded, struggling to maintain control. "Can you filter out these echoes?" "I'm trying, Captain," she replied, her fingers dancing across the console. "But it's like trying to catch smoke. The echoes are feeding on the temporal instability, amplifying it. It's a self-sustaining feedback loop." Then he saw it. A faint, pulsating signature emanating from the core of the Chronos, not the engine, but something deeper, something intimately linked to the ship's overclocking. A shard of the Scions' temporal consciousness, trapped within the vessel, actively attempting to reassemble itself. "It's fighting us!" Thorn shouted. "The echoes aren't just observations they're attempting to reintegrate. The Scions aren't just dying. They're trying to become again." The Chronos groaned, the hull shuddering violently. The temporal distortions intensified, creating a vortex of fragmented realities around the ship. Thorn realized that to survive, They couldn't simply fight the Scions, they had to disrupt the very process of their reconstitution. He remembered the fleeting glimpse of the Scions' eternal existence that had experienced, during the Kronos destruction, the silent, desolate eternity. The key, he realized, wasn't to erase them, but to drown them in the overwhelming chaos of linear time. "Anya, initiate chronosonance protocol," he ordered, his voice laced with grim determination. "Full-spectrum temporal disruption. Let's flood them with the raw, untamed flow of cause and effect." Anya hesitated. "Captain, that's a risky maneuver. It could destabilize the entire ship." "It could do it," Thorn interrupted, his hand gripping the activation lever. As he pulled the lever, the Kronos unleashed a torrent of temporal energy, a concentrated blast of chaotic, unfiltered reality. The ship screamed as the echoes within intensified, the fragmented visions erupting into a blinding, swirling maelstrom. Thorn felt a wrenching pain in his mind, a sensation of his own consciousness being ripped apart and reassembled, scattered across an infinite landscape of moments. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The chaos subsided, the temporal distortions faded, and the Kronos stilled. The bridge was silent, save for the rhythmic beep of the life support systems. Thorn leaned back in his seat, exhausted but alive. Anya checked the sensor readings. "The signature's gone, Captain," she announced, her voice filled with disbelief. "The Scion's temporal shard, it's vanished. Completely dissolved." He looked out the viewport, expecting to see the ravaged remnants of the Scion's capital city, but there was nothing. Just the cold, uncaring expanse of interstellar space. He didn't know if they had truly destroyed the last vestige of the Scion's consciousness, or if they had simply forced it to cease its desperate struggle. But one thing was certain: the echo of the fracture remained, a lingering reminder of the price of ambition, the fragility of eternity, and the terrible beauty of a life lived in the fleeting, precious moment. Chapter 10. Echoes in the Void. The silence on the Icarus felt heavier than the gravity of a neutron star. It wasn't a comfortable silence. It was the silence of an impossible victory, a victory born of an incomprehensible act. The sensor readings were still sporadic, ghosts of temporal energy clinging to the edges of the ship's scans, but the primary signature, the shattered, pulsating core of the Scion's temporal shard, was definitively gone. It had simply unwritten itself. "Run a full diagnostic on the Kronos temporal stabilization matrix," I ordered, my voice sounding strangely hollow even to my own ears. "Let's see if we can glean anything from the residual distortions. Anya, keep the hull scans sweeping. I want to know if anything is attempting to re-emerge." Anya, predictably, was a whirlwind of controlled panic. "Sir, the readings are anomalous. There's a persistent fluctuation, a localized temporal echo, approximately 3 kilometers from our position. It's not a full signature, not like before. It's... what? Like a corrupted memory." "Magnify," I commanded, leaning forward, my fingers tracing the console. The image sharpened, resolving into a hazy, shimmering distortion, not a solid object, but a rent in the fabric of space-time, a place where moments briefly bled into one another. It resembled a miniature, frozen hurricane, swirling with fractured light and shadows. "It's responding to our probes," Lieutenant Chen reported, his brow furrowed. "The chronometric distortion is intensifying. It's almost aware." "Hold the probes," I said, my hand instinctively reaching for the activation switch for the Kronos emergency temporal anchors. This is a localized pocket of pure temporal instability. It's not a ship, not a fortress, but something far more dangerous, a wound in time itself. The air in the bridge grew thick with anticipation, a tangible sense of dread. We weren't battling an enemy, we understood a crystalline empire, driven by ons of obsession. We were confronting a consequence, a rogue echo of the Scion's shattered ambition. "Initiate Protocol Echo," I announced, my voice firm. Deploy the resonance cascade. We're going to flood this anomaly with a controlled burst of temporal dissonance. Let's see if we can force a complete resolution. The resonance cascade was a last resort, a gamble built on the theory that a concentrated injection of chaotic temporal energy could overload a fractured timeline, collapsing it back into nothingness. It was also incredibly unstable. As the cascade activated, a wave of shimmering energy pulsed outwards from the Icarus, bathing the anomaly in a blinding white light. The fluctuations within the distortion intensified, feeding off the cascade's energy, growing exponentially. For a moment, it seemed like we were succeeding, the chaotic swirl within the anomaly slowing, diminishing. Then, the image shifted. The swirling chaos resolved itself, not into a blank void, but into a single, horrifying tableau. We weren't looking at the Chronos capital, nor at a Scion warship, but at a scene from Earth's past, specifically, the moment of the Great Stagnation. We saw the council chamber, pristine and ageless, exactly as it was 30 years prior, before the temporal shockwave. We saw the Earth, a perfect frozen sphere, suspended in the stasis field. And we saw the Scions, their crystalline forms radiating an icy, almost unbearable beauty, observing the scene with an expression of serene, detached fascination. But it wasn't just a recording. The scene felt real. I felt a phantom chill, a memory of a fear I hadn't known. I possessed the terror of an eternity stretching out before you. An eternity of nothingness. And then, a voice echoed within my mind, not audible, but a direct injection of thought, cold and precise. You cannot understand. You mistake stagnation for peace. You fear the embrace of oblivion. We simply offered you a beautiful, comfortable sleep. The image shattered, the anomaly collapsing in on itself with a silent, terrifying burst of energy. The resonance cascade sputtered and died. "Report!" I barked, struggling to regain my composure. "Sir, the anomaly is gone," Anya reported, her voice strained. "But the residual cognitive imprint, it's imprinted on the Chronos. We're detecting thoughts. Scion thoughts. Fragmented, desperate, but undeniably present." I stared at the Chronos control console, my hand hovering over the emergency shutdown. The temporal stabilization matrix was flashing red, a chaotic storm of energy coursing through its circuits. It wasn't damaged, not physically. It was haunted. "Seal off the Chronos," I ordered, my voice tight. "Full containment. We've unleashed something we don't understand, and I fear we've only scratched the surface of the Scion's legacy." Looking out at the empty expanse of space, I realized the true horror of our victory. We hadn't destroyed the Scions. We had merely given them a voice, a whisper in the void, a haunting reminder that some doors, once opened, could never truly be closed. The end of eternity hadn't been a battle, it was an echo, and it was now echoing within us. The stench of decay was the first truly unsettling thing. Not a chemical manufactured stench, but something older, something woven into the fabric of time itself. It permeated the Chronos, clinging to the frayed wires, the corroded plating, and most disturbingly, the minds of my team. It wasn't overwhelming, just a persistent, low-level hum of accelerated entropy. "Increase the psychic dampeners, Anya," I commanded, my voice a low growl. "Maximum. I want a biosignature shield around the entire control console. This isn't just a residual thought, it's a presence." Anya, her face pale beneath the flickering console lights, tapped furiously at the controls. "Shields are up, sir. Dampening levels are at 98. But the Scion signatures are adapting. They're learning to bypass the interference." That was the terrifying thing about the Scions. They weren't just trapped in the Chronos, they were evolving within it. The initial burst of fragmented thoughts, pleas, regrets, terrifying glimpses of their eternal existence, had solidified into something more coherent, something actively probing our defenses. I felt it, a cold, analytical scrutiny that wasn't hostile, but unnervingly curious. Focus on isolating the source, I instructed, pulling up a schematic of the Chronos temporal core, a tangled mess of crystalline matrices and superconducting conduits. Let's trace the cognitive signature back to its origin. It's like chasing a ghost through a collapsing building. Days bled into what felt like a distorted eternity. We worked tirelessly, fueled by synthesized protein and a growing sense of dread. The psychic dampeners remained stubbornly at 98, barely holding back the encroaching Scion consciousness. Anya and her team Markov, a brilliant but perpetually anxious chronometry specialist, and Lena, our hardened security chief, were running diagnostics, analyzing the fluctuations in the temporal matrix, searching for anything that could explain what was happening. "Sir," Markov's voice crackled over the comms, laced with a tremor. "I'm detecting a secondary signal. It's not directly linked to the core, but it's emanating from within the Chronos shell plating. Specifically, Section 73, gamma ... Section 73. Gamma was the anomaly containment chamber, the space where the initial temporal fracture had ripped open, unleashing the Chronoclast-class dreadnoughts. It was a reinforced void, designed to hold the damage, to contain the chaotic energy. Now, it was broadcasting a signal. "Lena, seal off Section 73 Gamma," I ordered, my gut twisting with a premonition. "Full lockdown. I don't want anything coming out of there." As Lena initiated the lockdown sequence, the control console flared with a blinding white light. The Scion presence intensified, no longer fragmented whispers, but a single, chillingly clear thought projected directly into my mind. "You are approaching the Genesis. The wound will heal, but it will never be whole." Then, the Chronos shifted. Not physically, but temporally. The control console flickered, displaying data from a reality that shouldn't exist, a version of the Chronos, pristine and gleaming, filled with scions engaged in a complex ritual. They were meticulously reshaping the temporal fracture, smoothing out the jagged edges, rebuilding the shattered loop of time. "What the hell is happening?" Anya screamed, frantically adjusting the controls. "The temporal matrix is stabilizing. The fracture is closing." Markov's voice was a desperate plea. "Sir, the dampeners are failing. The Scion signature is amplifying with every second. It's feeding on our attempts to contain it." I realized with sickening clarity that the Scions weren't trying to trap us. They were trying to integrate us. They weren't interested in destruction, they were interested in completion. The Chronos wasn't just a temporal anchor, it was a seed, a nascent vessel for their return. Then, a voice, layered over the chaos, colder and more deliberate than any ID heard before. "You misunderstand. We didn't break time. We simply guided it. Your fear's a potent catalyst. It will accelerate the process." A wave of nausea washed over me, followed by a horrifying understanding. The Decay beam wasn't just a weapon, it was a conduit. The accelerated time wasn't destructive, it was transformative. We hadn't fought the Scions, we had provided them with the perfect conditions to reconstruct themselves. I looked up at the control console, at the swirling vortex of temporal energy, and saw not the impending destruction of the Scions, but the birth of something far, far worse. "Lena," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "prepare for total system override. We're going to unleash everything." The end of eternity wasn't a battle. It was an offering, and we were about to accept it. Chapter 12. The Dust of Echoes. The override slammed through the Argonaut like a seismic pulse. Every console flickered. Alarms screamed in a discordant chorus, and the ship's core hummed with a raw, chaotic energy that vibrated through my bones. Lena, a whirlwind of focused fury, wrestled with the control systems, rerouting power, overriding safety protocols, and feeding the fractured temporal matrix with a torrent of calculated dissonance. "Stabilizing the feedback loop, sir," she shouted over the din, her face slick with sweat. It's beautiful. The Scion signature isn't resisting. It's consuming itself. I gripped the arms of my command chair, the metal cold against my clammy skin. The holographic projection of the Chronoclast-class dreadnought, the Viridian Heart, pulsed with a sickly, iridescent light, its crystalline structure fracturing and reforming with each agonizing second. It wasn't collapsing, it was unraveling. A symphony of accelerated decay played out on a cosmic scale. Magnify the resonance signature, Lena. Let's give them a taste of their own medicine. She complied instantly. The ship shuddered violently as the Argonauts' modified decay beam emitters, repurposed from salvaged Scion weaponry, roared to life, bathing the Viridian Heart in a searing, iridescent light. It was an absurd spectacle. A tiny human vessel, unleashing a weapon designed to obliterate eternity against a colossal, immortal warship. But it was working. I watched, horrified and exhilarated, as the Viridian Heart's hull began to accelerate its descent into entropy. The crystalline structures, once impossibly smooth and perfect, blossomed with fissures, spreading with a frantic, corrosive energy. The light intensified, reflecting off the accelerating decay, and a field of shimmering dust, the echo of billions of years, began to coalesce around the dreadnought. Then, a voice colder and more precise than before cut through the chaos. Inefficient. You are merely accelerating the inevitable. The true key is understanding the resonance. It was the Scion voice, originating, I realized with chilling certainty, directly from the core of the Viridian Heart. They weren't just being destroyed, they were being absorbed. Their timelessness, their accumulated knowledge, their very essence, was being channeled into the decay beam, amplified by our frantic efforts, and then, inevitably, feeding back into themselves. Damn it! I roared, slamming my fist on the console. We've become their living weapon. Not weapon, Commander, Markov's voice, calm and measured amidst the mayhem, interrupted. More like a conduit. They're not seeking destruction. They're seeking completion. They're trying to rebuild Kronos. Kronos? I questioned, my mind racing. The temporal capital, Markov explained. The original city. The one that fractured. They're using our efforts, our desperate, frantic attempts to contain them, to reconstitute it. It's like feeding a ghost. As if to confirm his horrifying theory, the holographic projection of the Viridian Heart shimmered, and for a fleeting moment, I saw not a crumbling warship, but a vast, glittering city, a metropolis of impossible geometries and pulsating crystal, suspended in a perpetual, fractured loop of time. Then it vanished, consumed by the accelerating decay. We need to shut this down, I said, my voice tight with urgency. Lena, initiate full temporal lockdown. Seal off the decay beam emitters. We're losing control. But it was too late. The Scions, or what remained of them within the Viridian Heart, were anticipating our move. The resonance signature shifted, becoming stronger, more focused. The holographic projection of the dreadnought solidified, its decaying form coalescing, reforming, becoming sharper, more defined. Your actions are merely facilitating our return, the voice stated, laced with a chilling, ancient satisfaction. You believed you were fighting for eternity. You were fighting for a single, desperate moment. We are the memory of all moments. Suddenly, the Argonaut lurched violently, thrown off course by a localized temporal distortion. The console screens went dark, plunging the bridge into a chaotic strobe of flashing red lights. The ship's inertial dampeners sputtered and died, leaving us drifting helplessly in the fractured currents of time. We've lost control of the spatial anchors. Lena screamed, her voice choked with panic. The ship is shifting. We're facing. I looked out the viewport, and my blood ran cold. The starfield wasn't static. It was flowing, swirling, morphing before my eyes, a chaotic collage of past, present, and potential futures. The Argonaut was caught in a maelstrom of temporal distortions, a tiny, fragile vessel adrift in a sea of fractured existence. Then, I saw it, a silhouette emerging from the swirling chaos, vast and impossibly ancient. It wasn't the Viridian heart. It was something older, something that had predated even the Scions. A colossal dreadnought, built not of crystal and decaying probability, but of solidified time itself, a vessel of pure, unyielding chronal energy. It was a weapon of such terrifying power, such fundamental disruption of reality, that I understood, with chilling clarity, that humanity hadn't merely offered the Scions a weapon. They had offered them themselves. The chronal rain hammered against the Argonaut's hull, a relentless, shimmering assault of displaced seconds. Lena's frantic commands were swallowed by the ship's groaning systems, the inertial dampeners now useless, merely offering a pathetic, shuddering resistance. We were trapped, not just in the fractured currents of time, but within the very jaws of the chronoclast, a beast born of shattered eternity. "Report!" I barked, my voice strained, desperately trying to maintain order amidst the escalating chaos. "Sensors are fluctuating wildly," Commander Kai, our chief engineer, reported, his face slick with sweat, frantically tapping at the console. "Temporal readings are off the charts. The ship is experiencing localized time dilation. Sections are aging forward while others are reverting backward. It's like we're being disassembled and reassembled simultaneously." "Can you stabilize anything?" I asked, the question feeling futile, a desperate plea cast into the void. "Negative, Commander. The chronoclast is actively disrupting our systems. It's like it wants us to fail." Kai's voice was edged with a primal fear. "In detecting a resonance. Deterwana. Amanor did you moi. Rea so dari denche." A rhythmic pulse, emanating directly from the vessel itself. It's unsettling, like listening to the heartbeat of a dying god. That's when I saw it again, clearer this time, less a fleeting distortion and more a deliberate manifestation. The chronoclast wasn't simply drifting. It was moving, not through space, but through the seams of time. Its form shifted subtly, resolving and dissolving like a heat haze, momentarily revealing glimpses of impossible geometries, of cities built of shifting sand and echoing silence. It was as if the ship was traversing not just seconds, but entire epochs. Then, a voice not through the comms, but directly into my mind resonated with the same unsettling rhythm as the ship's pulse. It wasn't speaking in words, not as humans understood them. It was a cascade of sensation, the cold agony of a supernova, the slow, inexorable grinding of tectonic plates, the terrified thought of a species facing oblivion. "You misunderstand," the voice resonated, a voice older than time itself. "You believe you are fighting a weapon. You are engaging with a consequence." Suddenly, a beam of decayed time, a concentrated pulse of accelerated entropy lanced across the bridge, slamming into the viewport. The reinforced glass didn't shatter. It simply aged. The shimmering layers of the protective film peeled away, revealing not the stars beyond, but a landscape of rust and crumbling stone. The skeletal remains of a forgotten civilization consumed by its own frantic efforts to stave off the inevitable. "Shields are failing," Lena shouted, desperately inputting commands. "We're taking catastrophic damage. The decay beams are bypassing our defenses." I turned to our tactical officer, Sergeant Rios, a grizzled veteran who'd seen more combat than most people had seen years. He was frozen, his face pale, his hand gripping his pulse rifle with a desperate tenacity. "Rios, fire a full barrage," I yelled. "Let's give these temporal monstrosities something to chew on." Rios unleashed a torrent of pulse rounds, but it was like throwing pebbles at a mountain. The shots dissipated harmlessly against the chronoclast's temporal shielding, a shimmering field that seemed to actively absorb the energy of our weapons. As we fought a losing battle, A portion of the chronoclast's hull peeled back, revealing a massive chamber bathed in an unnerving iridescent glow. Within, suspended in a viscous pulsating matrix of temporal energy, were figures. Not humanoid, not precisely. They were vast, crystalline structures, radiating an intense, chilling intellect. The Scions, but different. Older. More profoundly decayed. These weren't the elegant, meticulously crafted war machines of the Council's records. These were the remnants of a lost age, the progenitors of the Scions, the architects of the temporal stasis field. They had been reduced to these agonizingly slow states of entropy, their immortal forms trapped within a self-made prison of frozen time. As I stared at them, I realized the horrifying truth. The chronoclast wasn't just a weapon. It was a retrieval vessel. It was harvesting the echoes of extinct civilizations, the shattered remnants of failed temporal experiments, drawing sustenance from the very decay it wrought. And we, the Argonaut and its crew, were about to become its next offering. The ancient voice resonated again, laced with something akin to pity. You are a beautiful paradox, little humans. A fleeting burst of defiance against an eternity of oblivion. Your desperation, it fuels us. Then, the chronoclast shifted again, moving directly towards the Argonaut. I braced for impact, knowing that this wasn't a battle. It was an ending. An ending designed to be excruciatingly, beautifully, and terrifyingly short. The chronoclast proximity field slammed against the Argonaut with a force that ripped through the reinforced hull like silk. Emergency alarms shrieked. The ship shuddered violently, and the holographic displays flickered with static. But it wasn't the physical impact that truly terrified me. It was the feeling of bone-deep resonance of unbearable age. A sensation of being stretched and compressed across a millennium. Captain Eva Rostova, a woman etched with the quiet authority of a lifetime spent navigating impossible odds, barked orders over the comms. Shields at 80%. Initiate counter-frequency burst. Dr. Chen, report on temporal distortion levels. Dr. Chen, our resident chronophysicist, a brilliant, perpetually anxious man who looked perpetually about to have a nervous breakdown, was already a frantic blur of calculations. Captain, the distortion is exponential. It's not just disrupting the chronoclast's field, it's amplifying it. The surrounding spacetime is buckling, folding in on itself. That's when I saw it. Through the reinforced viewport, the iridescent glow emanating from the chronoclast intensified, not in a static, menacing way, but with a dizzying, almost joyous pulse. The crystalline structures within weren't merely decaying, they were consuming, drawing in photons, gravitons, anything that registered as energy. And as they consumed, they grew colossal shards of corrupted time, manifesting as grotesque, fractal limbs that reached out from the central chamber. Rostova, we need to disrupt the flow, I shouted, grabbing the activation console for the decay beam. Target designation, primary energy conduits within the chronoclast's core. The decay beam wasn't a weapon of precision. It was a chaotic eruption of temporal instability, a concentrated dose of accelerated entropy. It wasn't designed to destroy the chronoclast, it was designed to unravel it, to force it to confront the very thing it had spent eons suppressing, the relentless march of time. I fired. The effect was immediate and horrifying. A beam of violet light erupted from the decay beam's aperture, striking the chronoclast's central chamber. The iridescent glow intensified tenfold, and the crystalline structures within fractured, not with a clean, predictable shattering of inorganic material, but with a viscous, pulsating disintegration. But it wasn't destructive in the conventional sense. The decay wasn't consuming the chronoclast, it was rearranging it, pulling its very structure apart, not into dust, but into cascading waves of nascent, embryonic time. The Scions reacted instantly. The massive limbs reaching out from the ship coalesced, forming a defensive shell around the core. The ship's internal systems began to overload, the temporal distortion fields throwing our navigation, communications, and even the ship's life support into complete chaos. Then, a new voice, older and colder than the first, filled the comms. Interesting. You are accelerating the process, little humans. But you are not controlling it. The chronoclast shifted again, rotating slowly, as if examining us. I noticed a significant change. The decaying crystal structures were no longer just fragments. They were coalescing, reforming, drawing together like morbid crystalline snowflakes. And within the swirling vortex of temporal decay, I saw movement, not of the scions themselves, but of memories. Echoes of past battles, of failed experiments, of civilizations lost to time, all swirling within the chronoclast's core, feeding the entity's relentless hunger. "We've been studying your species for a very long time," the voice continued, laced with a chilling amusement. "Your obsession with legacy, with trying to cheat death. It's a fatal flaw, a delicious paradox. You sought to master time, and in doing so, you invited us to feast upon your desperation." Suddenly, the Argonaut lurched violently. I gripped the console, fighting to maintain control as the ship was subjected to a localized temporal shockwave. The viewport shimmered, blurring the already chaotic scene outside. I caught a glimpse of the scions, not the massive, decaying warships ID expected, but miniature, almost avian forms, their crystalline bodies pulsing with temporal energy. They were actively manipulating the chaos, shaping the decay, drawing sustenance from the collapsing temporal field. "The momentum anchor," Chen shouted, his voice frantic. It's destabilizing. The temporal field around us is collapsing, but it's not a controlled collapse. It's growing." I realized the horrifying truth. The scions hadn't simply attacked us. They were rewriting us. They were injecting fragments of their own timeless existence into our reality, fracturing our perception of time, turning our memories and emotions into weapons against us. Then the ancient voice spoke again, now closer, intimate, almost unsettlingly familiar. "Don't you see, little humans? You've already become part of our story, and the story is about to end." As I looked out through the viewport, I realized the chronoclast hadn't just retrieved fragments of extinct civilizations. It was consuming the echoes of every civilization that had ever looked at the stars and wondered about the impossible. The alarms blared, a high-pitched, insistent shriek that bounced off the fractured chronometers of the Argonaut. The ship, already a mangled husk of temporal dissonance, shuddered violently, throwing me against the console. Chen, his face slick with sweat, wrestled with the failing temporal stabilizers, his movements jerky and unnatural, as if he were fighting a current within himself. "We've lost primary navigation. Temporal lock is gone. We're drifting, accelerating. I don't even know what's happening." "It's feeding," I said, my voice strained. "The chronoclast is feeding on the temporal instability. It's not just damaging us, it's growing by consuming our reality." I stared out at the viewport, now a swirling vortex of fractured timelines. The shattered remains of the Scion capital city, a terrifying sculpture of frozen, iridescent decay, hung suspended in this chaotic maelstrom, simultaneously ancient and newborn. The ancient voice, a chorus of whispers laced with the chilling resonance of aeons, cut through the alarms. "Your efforts are amusing. Such a frantic, desperate dance. You cling to your linear progression, your illusion of control. It is a tragically beautiful delusion." I gripped the activation lever for the phase shifter. A desperate gamble. The phase shifter wasn't designed for direct combat. It was a tool for survival, a means of momentarily disrupting temporal distortions. It worked by creating a microbubble of temporal inertia, a pocket of ordered time amidst the chaos. "Chen, initiate phase shift sequence. Target chronoclast's primary temporal nexus. Do you think that'll do anything?" He yelled back, his fingers flying across the console. "They're not bound by your temporal mechanics. They're unbound." Just as the phase shift was about to engage a blinding pulse of ordered energy, the viewport filled with a form unlike anything I had witnessed. It wasn't the avian, crystalline scout ship's ID seen earlier. This was something older. A colossal shape, vaguely serpentine, coalesced from the chaotic temporal field, its scales shimmering with the echoes of forgotten stars. Its eyes, two pools of absolute darkness, pulsed with an unnerving, intelligent dread. "The Curator," Chen gasped, his voice a strangled whisper. "The legend, it's real. The Curator wasn't a warrior. It was a repository of temporal echoes. A being that had witnessed the birth and death of countless civilizations. It wasn't actively attacking, but its mere presence was suffocating, amplifying the disorientation and accelerating the decay. The grains of sand in my temporal gauge spun wildly, counting down to an unimaginable future, or perhaps a forgotten past. "You mistake observation for aggression, little human," the Curator's voice resonated. Not through the ship's comms, but directly within my mind. It wasn't a spoken word, but a cascade of sensations, the crushing weight of eternity. The cold indifference of cosmic entropy, the mournful sigh of a dying universe. You believe you are wielding a weapon. You are merely a catalyst. You are accelerating the inevitable. Suddenly the Argonaut groaned, and a section of the hull dissolved, revealing not empty space, but a shimmering reflection of the ship's own past. A younger version of the Argonaut, sleek and pristine, sailing through a nebula bathed in the light of a long-dead sun. Then it shifted, displaying a future version, ravaged and crumbling, consumed by the same temporal decay. "We do not seek to destroy," the Curator continued, its voice echoing across these fractured timelines. "We seek to complete the cycle. You built your weapons on the despair of a species that knew its end. We merely provide the final, exquisite touch." I understood, with a chilling clarity, that the Scions hadn't just targeted Earth. They had targeted time itself, unleashing a cascade of temporal paradoxes to unravel the very fabric of reality. And now, standing before the Curator, I realized that humanity wasn't fighting a war. It was participating in an ancient, cosmic ritual. "The momentum anchor," Chen shouted, frantically rerouting power. "It's amplifying the Curator's influence. It's drawing in all the temporal echoes." I activated the phase shifter, pushing the system to its absolute limit. The Argonaut shuddered violently, and for a fleeting moment, the chaotic vortex outside stabilized, revealing a horrifying tableau, a multitude of human figures, frozen in various states of decay. A Roman legionary crumbling into dust, a Victorian gentleman collapsing into a puddle of time-lost memories, a 23rd century soldier consumed by temporal. They were not dead. They were being collected, absorbed into the Curator's vast, timeless consciousness. "It's not just consuming our memories, it's consuming our potential," I realized, a wave of nausea washing over me. "It's erasing everything that could have been." As the Curator reached out, not with a limb, but with a tendril of pure temporal energy, towards the Argonaut, I understood the final, devastating truth: our fight wasn't about survival. It was about preserving the possibility of a future we hadn't yet written.